So for our final Tune In Tuesday, I wanted to go back to the beginning and talk about the basics of incentives and sanctions. This is a big part of what happens in juvenile drug treatment courts, and sometimes I think when we talk about it, we um, we skip over a little bit of the reasons why. And so I wanted to do a little more talking about that today. My name is Jessica Pierce. I am a senior site manager here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And along with our partners at All Rise, we are your training and technical assistance providers for juvenile drug treatment courts. If you have questions about juvenile drug treatment courts and how you should be operating, I do encourage you to reach out to us. We have lots of resources and lots of information we'd be happy to share with you. All right, so back to our Tune In Tuesday then. We're going back to basics, talking about incentives and sanctions. And so when we think about treatment courts altogether, one of the main differences that sets treatment courts apart from business as usual courts is this idea of providing people with services and supports to help them change their behavior. And when we think about our incentives and sanctions, that's really what they're there for, right? They're there to help us change behavior, help our youth change their behavior. So they're there as a mechanism to facilitate that. And it's very important, I think, to keep that as at top of mind as we think about incentives and sanctions, because sometimes it feels a little bit like you're like, oh, John hasn't gotten an incentive in a while. Let's give him a gift card, right? But just giving him a random gift card isn't going to really help him change behavior because he doesn't really necessarily know why he's getting that. So we're always wanting to think about how we're tying our incentive, our sanction to behavior that we want to see change. And when we think about behavior within the juvenile drug treatment court, we're thinking about it within the context of all of this other programming that's happening, right? So when we're thinking about incentives and sanctions, I want you to remember that your incentives and sanctions are happening in conjunction with your good case planning that's happening. Now, I'm not going to talk about case planning today. I'm not going to talk about really the drivers of youth crime or anything like that, because that's not what our topic is. But those things have to be in place for incentives and sanctions to really be effective, because we're, again, thinking about how we're helping kids change their behavior. And the idea of incentives and sanctions, again, really a strong part of our philosophy within the treatment court model. And certainly if you look at the juvenile drug treatment court guidelines, it has its very own guideline, our guideline number 5. So we're supposed to be implementing contingency management, case management, and community supervision strategies effectively. And this is where our incentives and our sanctions fall, right? So we are thinking about how we are going to apply our incentives to help support and youth in doing the behaviors that we want to see. And then we're going to use our sanctions, our consequences, our responses to help discourage youth from doing that behavior we don't want to see. And I'll tell you, you're all people, and so you probably know this from your own experience, but it's actually much easier to incentivize behavior we want to see than try to punish behavior we don't want to see. So always ask a question first of, is this a behavior we can incentivize, rather than waiting for somebody to do it wrong and then have to do a sanction. So the very basic concept of what we're thinking about when we think about contingency management, we think about incentives and sanctions, is this. We have 3 basic ways we can respond to behavior, not just in court, but all together across all of humankind. So we can reward behavior, we can punish behavior, or we can treat behavior. And when we're thinking about incentives and we're thinking about sanctions, we're mostly living in the reward and punish realm, right? We will talk a little bit in this table setting about treating behavior. But again, treating behavior is happening over with our treatment providers. And so that they have their own sets of incentives and sanctions. And certainly as a team, you should be coordinating incentives that are happening at treatment. You should be counting those, all of that. But treating behavior is its own separate subset of actions that need to occur with a youth that are different from rewarding a behavior or for punishing behavior, okay? So let's dive in a little bit into these categories. When we reward behavior, this is our incentive. And these are things that I think probably you recognize pretty easily from what we've talked about for years around incentives and sanctions. If you had come to a training with me, 10 years ago, I might have just had you create an entire long list of different things you could use as incentives, just to get you really thinking about what an incentive could look like. But what we found when we did that with teams is that you would get this beautiful long list, but you still wouldn't really use a lot of the things on the list. So we moved away from having you do that brainstorm. It can be a fun thing to do if you're doing like a team retreat and you want to think about, like, go pie in the sky and think about all the different ways you can incentivize behavior. It's not a useless thing. It doesn't really do anything if you don't have a plan and a mechanism for how you're going to apply them. So when we reward behavior, again, we're saying to people, this is what I want to see. So I'm going to give you something to help you continue to do that. And so first, of course, we have that kind of positive reinforcer. And those are very easy things. Those are things that we do naturally a lot of the time. That verbal praise that, hey, I'm really glad to see that you showed up on time today. That's really cool. Thank you very much for doing that, right? That verbal praise, that acknowledgement that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And that sometimes, when you get that praise, you get that little warm glow in your chest that you've done what you're supposed to do. When your boss tells you that you did a really great job on that presentation, you feel good about it. So with our youth, that's what we're thinking about doing too. I want you to think when you're doing your verbal praise to be really good and specific about what you're praising, not just good job, but good job because, or I like that you, those kinds of things, right? That applause in court, that's really nice too. Those tokens or points or tickets that kids can earn, those are all great, tangible rewards that sometimes can help make an accomplishment feel like a big deal. Gift certificates, or even just, certificates of completion or certificates of best student of the drug court that week, those kinds of things. Those are all really effective for kids. And so we're thinking about always how we can incentivize our behavior. And then on the other side of that, we have negative reinforcers. And you see the idea of negative here and you're thinking, oh, so this is where our sanctions come in. But this is not true. Negative reinforcers are part of our rewarding behavior. And in this case, negative reinforcers means that we are taking away a thing that we have imposed on youth that they don't really like. The most obvious example of a negative reinforcer is letting kids stay out later. So changing curfew. If you have to be in by 6 p.m., you've been doing what you're supposed to do. You're showing that you're making good use of your time. So we're going to let you stay out until 7, right? We're thinking about taking away something that is icky, that people don't want. So that's what negative reinforcers are. That could be waiving fees. It could be reducing the number of check-ins if a youth is doing very well, getting to check in by phone rather than in person, maybe fewer court appearances. So that's what we mean when we think about those negative reinforcers. And so when we think about the entirety of incentives that you can give out to kids, a lot of these, as you can see, don't cost any money. Most of your negative reinforcers don't cost money. And a lot of our positive reinforcers, like praise, or even getting a certificate that says, you were the participant of the week at the JDTC, that doesn't cost a lot of money because you're just using a piece of paper and your printer, right? So those things, these things can all be free. We don't always have to have that gift card, that paint set, those really obvious things that we think of when we think of incentives. So there's lots of ways to do incentives that can be free, and there's lots of different options you have when you think about what these negative reinforcers can look like that youth really want, right? Because they don't really want to spend a ton of time with you. So using negative reinforcement can be actually incredibly effective as a reward. All right, then we have our punishing behaviors. When we think about the court system altogether, it is set up to punish behavior. And one of the challenges we have with treatment court is that the youth who come to us in a JDTC are going to spend a long time with us, right? They're with you for 9 months, for a year, sometimes even 18 months. And so you can't just continue to punish a behavior that happened a year ago, 18 months ago. The way that the criminal justice system is set up is sort of to do a couple of things, right? Hold people accountable for breaking their trust with the community through crime, and then provide some supervision so that we make sure that they're not going to keep committing crime. And so when we have kids in our JDTC, we're doing a great job of doing that supervision because they're getting watched a lot, right? You're spending a ton of time with them, keeping an eye on them. So we got that supervision piece really taken care of. And then again, holding them accountable. A lot of times we get a little bit excessive in our holding youth accountable within a JDTC in a way that wouldn't happen for kids if they were on regular probation, if they hadn't gotten caught. Those kinds of things that we spend a lot of time holding youth accountable for behavior. And so as we're talking about our punishment behavior, I want you to really think about how we can be really thoughtful about the appropriate intensity of our responses so that we're not making you feel kind of despaired, like they can never get out of your JDTC. And I know for some of you, you might be thinking, oh yeah, we do have some kids who feel like they're never going to be able to leave the program. And that's not what we're looking for. We want to help them change their behavior, learn new skills. We want to rise up their protective factors, and we want to reduce those criminogenic needs so they don't continue to commit crimes. And so our punishing behaviors really should be focused on those things and really should be looking at mostly things that are driving criminal behavior. So our punishing behaviors, of course, are easy things like the verbal reprimand, community service, those individualized responses that are something that's important only to the youth, but not necessarily to the broader group of young people in your program, going into custody or being on electronic monitoring. These are all obvious punishing behaviors that we use within our court system and certainly within the JDTC. And then we have our response cost. And response cost is a lot like that negative reinforcement, right? So negative reinforcement, we're going to say that we have imposed a punishment on you. Now we're going to take away part of that. With response costs, we're going to add things back in. So if we have a young person who is not making good use of their time and we want to change their curfew, they might go from that 7 p.m. curfew to a 6 p.m. curfew. Right? We're thinking about how we can make kids kind of pay a little bit in the literal sense for what they're doing with their behavior. That means they might return to more frequent appearances. So again, not making good use of time. We're not feeling good about being able to trust them out in the community. So we're adding in an additional check-in with probation. We're adding in an additional appearance for a drug test. We're adding in more frequent court appearances. Each one of those things is there, again, to respond to that behavior. Now, one of the most important things to do when we're thinking about these responses to behavior is that you not only respond to the behavior, but then it's got to be about that messaging that you're talking to the kids about why there is a response cost now. And you can use language that is couched in skills we want them to learn. So that's why we're talking about things like you weren't making good choices, you didn't make good use of your time. And so this is the cost of that, right? This is the natural consequence when you don't make good use of your time. And then finally, we have those treating behaviors. And treating behaviors are, when we're treating behavior, we're trying to get to some of the underlying causes of why somebody is committing a crime or why they're using drugs. But we're also thinking about some of those facilitation factors, those things that really get in the way of us being successful at helping a youth change their criminal thinking. So if there's like a lot of trauma for that youth, certainly substance use can get in the way of addressing criminogenic needs. Those things, that's why we're doing this treating of behavior. And that's why it's really important for us to have our treatment providers on our team and for all of the legal folks, all of the justice folks to really trust that treatment provider when they talk about the youth behavior and what's happening with treatment and even what's happening with their substance use, because these are the folks that are the experts. And so when they're treating behavior, they may sometimes need to do some extra things. That treating behavior might be, we need to get another assessment. We think there might be some trauma here. We want to do a trauma assessment, those kinds of things. And then we might add in a trauma group we might say, your treatment provider might say they need an additional, they need to come to group a little more often. We're a little bit worried right now. And it might even mean that they might need a different level of care. They might need to go from intensive outpatient into like a residential facility. Right? Those things are all determinations that happen from treatment. And none of these things, either our enhancements or our reductions, should be thought about as either incentives or sanctions, right? This is all behavior. These are all to help us get a better understanding of what's going on with the youth and really helping them get a better understanding of what's going on with themselves. So don't ever think about treatment as a sanction. And when you're messaging, again, this messaging idea is so important. When you're messaging around adding in a new treatment group, you're not going to say, you weren't making good use of your time, so we're going to have you go to a new treatment group. We're going to say, we're a little bit worried about you, and we think that an additional treatment group going to the trauma group, going to seeking safety, we think that could be really good for you. And so we'd like you to try it out because we can see that there's some stuff going on, and if you don't deal with it, it's going to keep being a factor in your life. And so you're thinking about how you message that. You don't say that this is a response to behavior that you don't want to see. You say, you're doing some concerning behavior, we're adding in something to help address that. And the same with treatment reductions. We're not saying, hey, you've earned this and this is a reward for doing so well in treatment. Instead, we're saying, hey, it looks like you're a little more stable right now. You maybe don't need quite so intensive of services. So we're going to reduce some of that so you can concentrate on some other parts of your life, right? So we can add in some pro-social opportunities for you, all of those kinds of things. That's what we're thinking about. We're messaging this, we're talking about it, and we're really partnering with our treatment providers to make sure when we're treating behavior, that's what's happening, and that we're never, ever using treatment as a sanction. All right, so that is kind of our foundation for how we think about behaviors with folks. All right, so now I want to ask you, I want everybody to answer a question for me, which is, what makes a response to youth behavior effective? So we're going to use our Slido today. Slido.com. You can go to that website if you'd like to, or you can scan the QR code in the upper corner of your screen, and then you enter in the number 3813391, and that'll let you respond to my question. So what makes a response effective? And there are 5 things, and you might have heard about them a couple of times before. All right, let's see if folks are able to get into the Slido. All right, meaningful to the youth. Yes, we have many examples in our own lives of an incentive or a sanction that's meaningful to one person, but not meaningful to another. So if it's not meaningful, it's not terribly effective. Something that's going to actually change behavior and make an impact. Something that's immediate. Yeah, immediacy is one of those primary factors in our research. Something that's timely and meaningful. We've got gratitude. So something where you're really expressing like gratitude to the youth, you're using your language in a different way to make sure that you're not just saying, hey, good job, kid. You're really being thoughtful about how you express that. Increasing the behavior you were intending to increase, right? We want to keep seeing the behavior we want to see, and we want to decrease the behavior we don't want to see. We want it to lead to behavior change. We want it to be proportional to the behavior. Yeah, that's so hard sometimes in court, because especially in drug court, because you guys are seeing the kids so often, and sometimes you're feeling like you got to respond to lots of little behaviors, and it can feel like your responses don't really match up. You don't have a response that matches that same kind of size of behavior. We want to see the change happen actually within youth. And so often we're not sure, right, if our treatment court responses actually end up having long-term consequences or long-term change for the youth. We don't ever really know. But hopefully things become intrinsic to somebody's nature, and we do see a more long-term change. All right, so I'll give you the answer. We'll move on here. So we want to be fair, immediate, appropriate. We want our responses to be certain or consistent, and we want them to be individualized. So these are the kind of 5 principles of contingency management within a juvenile drug treatment court. And again, when we think about contingency management, what we really are thinking about is responding to behavior. So it comes from the world contingency management does. It started out with like Pavlov and his research back in the day, but we can see this in lots of different ways, and we can see it playing out in lots of different places. We use contingency management in our education system. If kids are in detention, there's a contingency management system there. All of these things work together to help a person change their behavior. And we are imposing external forces to help with that behavior change when kids are in the system with us. So we sort of create the structure for things to be fair, for things to be immediate, for things to be of appropriate intensity, for things to be certain or consistent, and for things to be individualized. And again, there's lots of research around each one of these elements, and we're going to dig into them now. So we'll start with fair. So when kids are in treatment court, it can be hard, really hard to be fair and also individualized. It feels like when we tell you to do those things that we're kind of setting you up, right? Because being fair feels like the easiest way to be fair is that everybody gets the same thing, right? You get what you get, you don't throw a fit. And kids are very, very aware of fairness. It's a lot to do with how adolescent brains develop, how kids are moving from being concrete thinkers to being abstract thinkers. And so being fair is a huge thing for young people. And you've no doubt have heard it's not fair, both within your JDTC and probably if you're a parent, from your own kids. So being fair is such a big deal. And it's really hard to be fair across all youth. But we know that our voice and our choice can increase feelings of fairness for youth. And we're going to talk more about voice and choice when we get to talking about individualized. And so when you do research on this and you ask kids about what does fairness mean, what they want to see is they don't necessarily need you to do the exact same thing to every single kid for the same thing. So you have 2 kids who missed a treatment group. They don't have to get the exact same response in order for them to perceive that it's fair, but they want the responses to feel proportional, right? They want the responses to feel like they're equivalent responses. And so one of the best ways to do this then is to make a grid of responses. So this is going back to our old graduated sanctions days a little bit. But we can use this in a new way within the treatment court. And I'm going to talk about it now. And then when we get to individualized, I'm going to bring this back around. But the idea is that you think about all of the behaviors you have to respond to in the treatment court. And you're going to kind of give them sort of a weight. You're going to say, there are some little behaviors that have that we don't want to see, but we're not gonna bring the hammer down. Those are things like, so I'm calling those tier 1s. Those are tier 1 activities, tier 1 behaviors. So that's doing like showing up to all of your appointments, doing all of your check-ins. Those are low-level stuff that you're like, you got to respond, but you don't want to respond big if they've done it wrong. And you also don't want to like be giving out a gift card every time somebody shows up for a drug test because you're going to run out of gift cards super fast. So you're thinking about that response and making sure that you kind of know what those look like. So you're gonna say to kids, look, within our program, we have different kind of levels of behaviors we want to see from you. And when you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, you're kind of eligible for all of these sort of good things. If you're not doing what you're supposed to do, here's some of the responses that we might use. And you can see from the responses, there's lots of different options. And you might get a slightly different option than somebody else. We're going to work with you to pick the responses that make the most sense for you. And so they can see then it's laid out. You're being transparent about how this looks. when we're being really fair with kids, we're not trying to hide things from them. We don't want kids to not know what's going to happen in the program. We don't want them to be surprised ever. Like, kids should never be surprised that they're going to get a sanction. They should always know that they're going to get a sanction. They should usually know what that sanction is going to be. None of this should be a surprise. So this idea of this transparency, and then figuring out as a program what your kind of different levels of responses are, and your different levels of behavior that you're going to be addressing, what those look like. Kids should know that. And they should know then that if they make it to all of their check-ins, they're going to get to do one of these things from the incentive side of things. But they're going to get to pick what that is. And so they might pick a fun-sized candy bar that day because they're like, yeah, I really want that Baby Ruth. While another kid in that same circumstance might say, I'm going to just go ahead and save, my reward here. If I'm getting a point or a ticket, or I'm getting, or I get whatever it is, I want to save it up to get a bigger prize later on. Those are both perfectly valid choices for those young people to make, but they get to make it, right? So we're thinking about having this idea, the grid of responses.
It's like verbal gift cards. Yeah. You also do.
Oh. Okay, good. We had somebody whose microphone came on there. Okay, we're back to it now. So we're thinking about making our grid of responses. And this is something that you're going to have to think about as a team and really work out what these different tiers and levels look like. You can't really do this. You don't need to do this individually with each youth to design their own grid. Instead, program-wide grid. And then the kids, again, will pick from the response column. All right, so that's what we're thinking about for fair. And I want to now know from all of you kind of what you're doing to make your responses fair. So if you could, again, use Slido and write some things that you're doing into Slido. And I see here in our chat, we have Tim Vanderwall saying, fair, firm, and friendly, the 3 Fs for our responses. I like that very much, that fair. So kids know that it's fair, but that you're going to be firm about it. Like, I think so often we think about how we're interacting with our kids, and firm and friendly, I think, is such a perfect way to think about how we want like judges to be in the court, how we want probation officers to be. Okay, good. So now I was stalling a little bit while I was waiting for people to type. We now have some responses coming in. How are we making our responses fair? Consistency. Consistency is a big part of fair. Now, consistency has its own category, so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But consistent, equitable, yeah, exactly. We're thinking about how we make sure that we can be consistent in our responses, how we can be equitable. Again, we want kids, because kids are going to be comparing themselves to the other kids. It's a normal part of adolescence. It's a really normal part of humanness. So they're going to be thinking about, what did you get for this? What did I get for this? So they always want to be able to see that it's fair. Individualized and proportional to behavior. Okay. Now, does anybody have something that's really like concrete that they're doing, like the grid that I was talking about? Ensure that it matches the behavior. Yeah, good. All right, I'm going to move us on, because these all match up to some of the other things we want to talk about. Now, I want to talk about immediacy next. And if we look at like the behavior change literature, one of the strongest components of really changing behavior is that the response to the behavior happens as immediately to the behavior as it can. And as you can imagine, that makes a ton of sense, because we really want that connection in the brain between the behavior and the response to click. And so immediacy is such an important part of contingency management. And it's one of the areas that I think it's hardest for courts to figure out how to do, so that the impact is really immediate, and that it can be felt by the youth. So when we think about immediacy, I want you to think about how you're approaching your work as a team. I will tell you, back in 1989, when the first adult drug court started, one of the big pieces of the concept around treatment court was the idea of the team approach. and being non-adversarial because everybody wanted to be in a position where they were helping the client make different choices, make changes in their lives. And that meant that you couldn't have like the prosecutor and the defense attorney kind of arguing in court, because that would sort of negate the helping part of our treatment courts. And so we moved everything kind of behind the curtain. So I think that a lot of that sort of arguing that happens between defense attorneys and prosecutors often happens in treatment court still, but it just doesn't happen in front of kind of the audience of the drug court clients. And when we think about that, that I think at the time made everybody feel like they wanted to have an opportunity to weigh in on responses that were going to be given to each client. And that led us to things like voting. Your treatment court does not have to every single time weigh in on whether or not John's curfew should get changed, right? That's not a great use of your time, and it doesn't make a ton of sense that we're going to wait to make that change until 2 weeks from now when the team can meet. So we're thinking about immediacy, and we're thinking about changing the way your court is operating. That's what this detailed process means. And so I'm going to tell you, you can make your incentives and sanctions more immediate by holding regular team business meetings. And you might have heard me talk about these business meetings before. A business meeting is a meeting that your team is having that is not case staffing, that is not a court hearing, that you're doing once a month, once every other month, where you're talking about how your program operates. This is the place where you're looking at your data. This is also a place where maybe you're sometimes brainstorming like new community connections. This is a place where you can do like a big list of different incentives you could use. But this is also where at these business meetings, you are going to hash out the design for your incentives and sanctions so that when we go back to our grid, you've already decided as a team what this grid looks like, and your probation staff, your case managers, even some of your treatment staff, they are empowered to just do these things, right? They're empowered to just give that fun-sized candy bar. They are empowered to change that curfew from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. They have that power because we don't need you as a whole team to vote on that for each individual youth. It bogs down your staffings and it doesn't make sense for immediacy. So we're thinking about doing all of this work on the front end so that you know what that looks like. Now, of course, there are going to be sanctions that you're giving out or even some incentives that you're giving out that for whatever reason can't happen like out in the field, right? I don't want probation to take kids to detention without the attorneys and the judge weighing in, right? I want detention to be something that's different. And so when you think about that grid, my example here only has that like tier 1 behaviors. So those are the lowest of the low. That's an easy grid for me to make as a person who doesn't work in a treatment court. But for like tier 2 or tier 3 or what tier 4 might look like, those are things that, again, you're going to have big conversations as a team, and you're going to figure out these are the behaviors that we need to address as a team. These are the things where our defense attorneys are saying, I have to be part of that conversation. I'm not going to just sign off on that, right? So that's why it's so important for us to have these business meetings. Then we give our probation and our case managers, even treatment, we give them the power to do a lot of these incentives out there in the field. We give them the power to do a lot of these sanctions. Now, again, for incentives, we want you to have like a good strength-based atmosphere at court. That can mean that like kids get to spin prize wheels. Maybe they pick from the prize closet. So sometimes the incentive that happens out in the field might just be, hey, you get to spin the prize wheel this week. Good job. Can't wait to see you do that. And then they come to court and they spin the prize wheel. That's okay. But we want to make sure that as much as we can, things are happening immediately. And again, if kids are going to get a good thing, they know that that's coming so that they're ready and they're prepared for their reward. You have to, again, talk about it as a team. And then when you're doing those future business meetings, after you come up with this plan and created your grids and you've got your probation officers out there in the field doing it, the future business meetings, you're going to talk about, how do we think this is working? What kinds of questions do we have? Do we think we need to adjust or change any of this based on this working and being live instead of just being something that we came up with in our heads? So this is how we make things immediate. You talk as a team, you make a plan ahead of time, and then you say to probation, go out and make it happen. Okay? All right, now appropriate intensity. Again, when we have kids with us for as long as you do in a treatment court, you're going to see a lot of behaviors and you're going to feel like you got to respond to a lot of behaviors. So my first recommendation is to get rid of any behaviors that you're going to not want to respond to. So lots of courts are reducing their conditions of probation so that they don't have, a laundry list of 18 or 20 things they're trying to keep track of. It doesn't make sense for kids that are under this level of supervision to have so many specific, nitpicky, little, tiny, detailed things to be looking out for. So instead, we're thinking about getting there. Lots of courts are getting rid of that. Lots of courts are really thinking about rules. So we have lots of rules sometimes we want people to follow. Things like no hats in the courtroom or no chewing gum. And those kinds of rules can also sort of get in the way of this appropriate intensity because we spend a lot of our time sort of trying to just stamp out those little behaviors that we're like, I don't love this behavior, but it also is not like the reason a young person is committing a crime. Like them chewing gum in the courtroom is not a crime, and it's not really about them committing a crime. They're not, it doesn't drive their criminal behavior. So thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it can be really helpful for that appropriate intensity. So as a team, think about like rules that you have, think about those conditions of probation that for treatment court maybe just don't need to be there. They can just go whoop, and we don't have to think about tracking it and monitoring it because we've got so many other great things that we're doing with our youth. All right. We want to make sure that we're thinking about that, those ages and stages of development. Sometimes our kids are going to be really kind of jerks to the staff of the treatment court. And we don't want to respond to regular adolescent behaviors, that talking back, that all of those arguing, even kind of that hostility, the sullenness, the not speaking. Those are things that are really frustrating for us as adults when we're talking to kids, but those are things that don't actually need us to respond at all. That's typical adolescent behavior that does not require us to respond. So we want to think about those things and we want to say, we're going to just let, John go have a timeout and cool off, and then we're going to come back and try to figure this out. We're not going to add a sanction because he was talking back to the judge or because he won't say anything in probation. It's not going to help us. So we're going to get rid of those kinds of thinking as well, because we know for adolescent development, it's not going to be effective. We're going to think about, we're not going to overreact to that when kids are being kids, because we always have to maintain our composure and we don't want to get triggered as adults in those situations. And if we feel like that's happening to us a lot, then that's a good time to think about, like, are you approaching a level of burnout where you really need to think about how to manage that and go to your supervisors and talk about that. And then again, these graduated responses are going to give us lots of time to work with the youth. So what does that mean? So the easiest way that we've seen, and in the contingency management literature, it's very clear. The idea of a point system is so easy for helping you do little incremental responses rather than big responses. So a point system lets you respond to minor youth behavior, good and bad, with that small incremental reward. So yay, you went to school every day this week. And you haven't had a problem going to school. So all you do is you just earn a point for that. We're not throwing you a party. We're just saying, yes, you're doing what you're supposed to do. I'm paying you kind of to do what you're supposed to do, rewarding you with a point. They can earn points for those compliant behaviors, right? Because we have a lot of things where we're looking at just in terms of compliance. We're not even thinking about behavior change at that point. We're just thinking about, are you doing the things we asked you to do? Are you showing up where we tell you got to show up? And that can, again, if we spend all of our time just responding to those behaviors, did you go to your drug test or not? Did you go to school or not? Did you go to a group or not? Then we miss out on that second piece of things where we're actually helping kids make different decisions and learn how to make better choices. The other thing when we're thinking about sanctions is our very first kind of sanction, the very first consequence, the very first response to a kid not doing what they're supposed to do is just that they don't earn that point. And so that's a very easy, very proportional thing for most of these behaviors, these little behaviors, you broke curfew, you were out 20 minutes later than you were supposed to be. You don't earn a curfew point this week, right? We're not coming down hard. It's, again, this helps us be really fair because it feels super proportional. And then the trick is, though, that then kids have to be able to do something with those points that's useful and meaningful to them, because we do need them to have a value that is important to kids. And if they can't use their points, then they don't care about accumulating them. So they're not going to ever feel like, oh, if only I'd gotten home 20 minutes earlier, I would have gotten my curfew point, and then I could have picked from the prize closet. That's the kind of thing where we need it to have a value. So usually points get attached to incentives where kids can save up their points to spend on incentives. So this is an easy way to stretch out our incentive budget. And in a lot of programs now, kids actually need a certain cumulative amount of points to move up to the next phase and to complete the program. Points are super easy because it's something they can count, something you can count. And it's a way to make things of that appropriate intensity. It's a very simple way to start our graduated responses. So a lot of times when we're thinking about graduated responses and we're thinking about it in regular court, with a kid on regular probation, we start out right there at that community service level, and usually at 8 hours of community service at a time. And then if they don't do the community service, they keep doing the behavior you don't want to see, you go right on up into electronic monitoring. And then if that didn't work, you're right into going to detention. And so in that kind of grid, when we start way up at the top, we don't have a lot of wiggle room. So within our treatment courts, we have to add so many layers to go to that appropriate intensity for those small behaviors that we're going to be seeing, that we feel like we have to respond to. But maybe we're getting rid of some of them so we don't have to have quite so many. We're thinking about that. All right. So now I want to ask you, what are you doing to make sure your responses are an appropriate intensity? If you have a point system, you could type a little bit about that. If you have another strategy that you're using, I think people would be interested to hear about it. So let's see what people come up with. And you can put responses in chat if you'd rather. They use paper dollars in a court, and when they reach $10, they draw for a prize. Yeah, my daughter's school used what they call dragon dollars. So kids would get dragon dollars at school for doing what they were supposed to do, and then they could spend them. A graduated response matrix, excellent. Yeah, really having lots of thought put into these things and making them super concrete for yourselves and for the youth, I think is such a key way to approach this. So if you look at your policies and procedures and you feel like they're pretty vague, I want you to go back and I want you to make them super specific, because that is really helpful for you. And then it's really helpful for how you're talking to the kids too and their families. All right, we have anybody else that's going to weigh in here? Other ideas? I'll give you another 20 seconds to finish a thought. All right. If you have other ideas and you want to put them into chat as we go along, please feel free to do so. All right, now we're to individualized. And individualized, I think, is such an important part of how we approach everything in juvenile justice, that there should be no cookie cutter responses for kids in juvenile justice, because everybody's different. But even though we don't want cookie cutter responses, we also don't actually have that many different options of things available to us, right? You cannot legitimately make a completely tailored program for 50 different kids, 20 different kids. It gets really hard. And so we do have to have some broad structures in place within our treatment court, to make sure that we can make things individualized. And the best way to do that is to incorporate youth voice and choice. You heard me just say pick from the prize closet. Like, having kids always should get to pick their own incentive, and they should always get to pick their own sanction up to the place where we're getting to electronic monitoring or detention. Before that, though, they should get to choose every single time. That voice and choice is such an important part of making things individualized. It's such an important part of making things fair. And so I really urge you to do that. We want to obviously always prioritize rewards over sanctions. Sometimes you'll hear us talk about that 4-to-1 ratio of those incentives to sanctions. And the 4-to-1 ratio just means that we want to, again, be focused on promoting the behavior we want to see rather than having to respond to the behavior we don't want to see. So that's what that 4-to-1 really means. It does not mean that I need you to scour your brains to figure out how you can incentivize somebody 4 times before you sanction them. It doesn't mean that kids can't get incentives and sanctions at the same time. And it likely means that you need to think about how you're counting your incentives. Most courts don't count incentives like things like verbal praise. You're not counting that as an incentive, but that is an incentive. Most courts don't count snacks that kids get when they show up to a place. If you have, a box of chips that you let kids pick a bag of chips out of every time they come to your office for a probation meeting, that's an incentive to show up. And you are incentivizing that behavior, the behavior of showing up. Lots of treatment providers give out snacks every time kids show up, partly because kids can't really engage if they're hungry, but also to incentivize showing up. You might not be counting those. So I want you to really think about counting all of your incentives as well. That's a little aside because that's not really about individualized. And then we want to capitalize on youth strengths. So what does this look like in practice? So to make your incentives and sanctions fair, and to make them individualized, incorporate youth voice and choice. So the way to do our youth voice and choice is this. Survey all of the youth, and you can do like a pen and paper survey, certainly. But I've seen a lot of courts where the coordinator is really involved before court in just kind of chatting with kids and families out in the hallway while they're waiting. This is a great place for coordinators, for probation officers, for defense attorneys to just be like, hey, we're thinking about adding some incentives. What kinds of things would you like to see if we were to create a prize closet? What would you like to have in the prize closet? And you're just going to make some notes and jot down some things that kids are asking for. Right now it's the holiday season, and here at the National Council, we're actually collecting some toys and different things for one of our local organizations, the Children's Cabinet. So they're going to give these presents out to foster kids. And they made us a list of things the kids would want. And no doubt they talked to the kids in foster care to figure out what that list should look like. You can do the exact same thing for your incentives. We want to just ask kids, hey, what kinds of things are you looking for here? And sometimes they're not going to know, or maybe it's going to be 1 or 2 vocal kids, but I want you to keep asking. I don't want this to be like a one-time thing. I want this to be, every couple of months, you're going to just check in and be like, hey, is there anything you guys are looking for that you didn't get last time that you want to see this time? Kids will be way more likely to tell you as they feel comfortable with you. And then when we're having our individual meetings with kids, so probation, when you're doing these check-ins, treatment, I want you to talk about what their case plan looks like and how rewards will be part of that case plan and where the rewards will fit and what kinds of rewards they think will be useful to them. And then you also want to ask that question about sanctions. I know for a lot of you probation officers, you'll often ask a kid, you'll be like, well, you didn't go to group this week like you were supposed to. What kind of consequence do you think you should have for that? And just sort of leave it open and let kids kind of fill in the blank. I want you to do that same thing, but I want you to do it ahead of time. So it's not after they've already done the behavior. I want them to know ahead of time what it's gonna be. So they can make that kind of choice. They can go, I know if I don't go to group this week, then I'm gonna have to do 4 hours of community service. And I really don't want to do that. So I guess I'll go to group, right? We want them to do that cost benefit analysis. And if they decide that they'd rather do 4 hours of community service than group, that's useful to us as well, because they made a decision. It wasn't the decision we wanted, but they did. You can talk to them all kinds of ways about that. And it gives us maybe some insight into like maybe things are getting hard and they don't want to go to group right now. So maybe we got to switch things up, right? So we're thinking always about that information we can get. And then I want you to create a response menu for kids. So we go back to that idea of we did our grid. Now what kids are going to see is this. They're going to see their response menu level 1. And it's going to say, yay, you did what you're supposed to do. Pick a reward. And they can pick one of these things. And they get to pick it. And you will have decided as a team what that looks like ahead of time for the most part. But this is where our voice and choice comes in, where we can say, I can't just give you whatever you ask for, because that's not how this works. They get to pick, though, one of these things. So they get to pick that they go in the fishbowl drawing, or they get to pick that they get an extra one of those paper dollars that the team was talking about when we asked about those things. They get to pick from the snack box. They get to pick from the bottom shelf of the prize closet, whatever it is. Maybe they earn $2 toward a gift card. And when they've saved up a total of $10, they get the gift card, right? And then we do the same thing. We say, you didn't make good use of your time. You got to have a consequence, pick a consequence. And again, we're looking at that tier 1. So this is like not making it to a meeting. This is not doing a check-in. This isn't things like a negative or a positive drug screen or anything like that. These are just the, did you show up or not? So we're going to only have low-level responses. So that might be stay after court for an hour. That might be you get 1 hour of community service. And I really want you to increment your community service in hours instead of day chunks. You get 1 hour of at-home community service. This is a great one that lots of teams started to do during the pandemic, where they couldn't have kids going out into the community to do community service. So they started asking kids to do things like do the dishes at home. I think this is a great thing that teams should keep. It helps us with our family engagement. And as long as you feel like you're comfortable and that parent is comfortable, why aren't more of your sanctions happening in the home? It's a very, very easy way to do it. You don't have to wait for work crew. You don't have to do any of those things. Instead, you're going to say, your sanction this week is going to be 1 hour of at-home stuff. And I've already talked to your mom, and here are your 3 options for your at-home community service. And they get to pick. They maybe could pick an essay. And so often when I talk to teams, they say, oh, we'll let them pick. They don't have to do an essay. We'll let them pick between doing an essay, a rap, writing a poem. And that's cool. But I want you to take it a step further. I want you to give them the choice to pick writing that essay or doing that hour of community service. That's where really that voice and choice comes into play. They're not going to want to do any of these things, but maybe there are some kids who are just never, ever going to write you an essay, no matter how much you want them to. Don't ever just assign it. Always give them a choice between this or that. And you can see for my imaginary response menu here, I tried to think of things that would take about an hour. So that's why I have, stay after court for an hour, do an hour of community service. I think a 300-word essay is about an hour. For some kids, it might be longer. But that's the thing, is they always get to pick these things. They don't ever have something where you tell them they have to do it. So that's what we think about when we're thinking about both fairness and individualized, this voice and choice every single time. All right, so what are you doing to individualize your responses? We'll see if anybody wants to chime in here before we wrap up with our last category. Let's see if anybody's going to chime in. Oh, somebody's coming into chat. Using motivational interviewing. Yeah, motivational interviewing is such an important tool to have. It really helps you think about how you're talking to the kids, and really helps puts the decision making in their hands. If you can help them kind of steer them to that using motivational interviewing, it's incredibly powerful. So thank you, Tim. I think that's really smart. Okay, so participants are completing a survey in this court listing incentives they would like to receive. I think, again, the more you're asking them what kinds of incentives, and then, I always like the prize closet when I would do birthday parties and stuff for my daughter. If we played a game, the kids could pick from the prize box. they would always pick Pokemon cards, weirdly. No matter what kind of kid they were, everybody wanted Pokemon cards. And maybe your kids at drug court want Pokemon cards too. I don't know. It's big again. So you're always thinking about, though, asking them what they want, because sometimes they're going to want weird things that you didn't think of. They're going to want like Flamin' Hot Cheetos is a snack that lots of kids like, and so you're going to just stock up on that, and you'd be amazed at how cheap a lot of these things are. And then again, they'll tell you about all of the things that they want that don't cost you money, because it's about not seeing you. At the case planning stage, list what incentives and sanctions are for with that youth. Then really talk to the parents about what parents can offer at home, and then working together shoulder to shoulder. Absolutely. I love that idea that we're working with our parents. And that, again, I think a lot of, especially for little behaviors, a lot of our consequences, a lot of our responses can happen at home. Now, there are times I think where it's okay within your response grid to say that the kids maybe lose the option to choose because of some certain kinds of behaviors. And that's a conversation I want you to have as a team, to say, is there ever a time where we're going to say you've lost your option to choose? And that might be like when we're thinking about home detention, when we're thinking about electronic monitoring, when we're thinking about going to the detention facility. That's probably not a place where kids get to pick, would you like to go to detention or not, right? But you want to have that conversation. All right. Thank you very much for responding. And then our last category, we want to be certain and consistent. And this idea can sometimes feel scary to teams because they want to keep like their cards close to their chest, like you're playing poker with the kids. But again, we want to be super transparent, and we want to make sure that those clarifications of expectations and consequences are just really spelled out for kids over and over again. I know it says on the front end on my slide, and I think yes on the front end, but like all the time. I often say when we're talking to kids, we want to think about it a little bit like we're on a game show. I love The Price is Right. I watch it when I stay home from work. And every single time they're going to do any one of those games, Drew Carey, now as the host, explains the rules of the game, because that's part of their legal requirement. Every time you're doing anything with kids, I want you to explain the rules again, over and over again, until it's really just baked into their brains, right? We want to make sure that this is super predictable for them, that they know what's going to happen. And then we want to make sure that we have those blended responses. So that means that if kids earn an incentive and a sanction, they get both. All right. So the way to be certain and consistent is to always do what you say you are going to do. Youth should always know ahead of time about potential rewards and consequences for behavior. If they do the behavior and it was the behavior we wanted, they get the reward. If they do the behavior and it wasn't what we wanted, they get the consequence every single time. So that means that you want to make sure this appropriate intensity is such a big part of this, because you don't ever want to feel bad about giving the kid the consequence where you're like, oh, this feels too much, right? You don't want to feel like that. So you always want to make sure that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And that means, judges from the bench, I never want you to say, I'm going to give you a second chance. Kids don't need that second chance. They knew what they were supposed to do. They didn't do it. We're not gonna do that. Now, with adults, sometimes that's part of therapeutic jurisprudence, to like withhold the response. Kids don't think that way. For youth, we always do what we say we're going to do. We're going to be consistent and always do it. Now, sometimes you're going to have excuses like, I couldn't get a ride. And so you should really know ahead of time what excuses you accept, how many times a kid can make that excuse. And then when a kid makes an excuse about things, you have to work together as a team to get rid of that excuse. And so that might mean that you're going to have to give some rides. But I don't want you to have to give rides every single day, every single time to that one kid who's going to just kind of start to be like, yeah, I don't have a ride. Instead, you are going to say, I'm giving you a ride for the next week. Doing that, we're being consistent, we're showing up, we're getting rid of barriers. All right, that's it for today. We are at the end of our Tune In Tuesday for 2023. I'm going to leave you with this question of what you'd like to see in 2024. So if you have some topics you want to get training on next year, go ahead and write them right now. I'm asking Lori Pumphrey, our program assistant, to put it's already here, the evaluation into the chat. And then also Lori, if you could put the Tune In Tuesday um, tool into the chat for folks to download, that'd be great. Not the Tune In Tuesday, the four-pronged approach. I'm sorry. All right, so if you have training topics you'd like to see next year, go ahead and use the Slido or put them in chat for me. And you can click on that link for the four-pronged approach. It goes into much more detail about incentives and sanctions here. Oh, finding peer support. Okay, that's a great choice. I like that. And peer support for kids looks a little different too. We're still trying to figure out what that means. All right, we're right at our time. The Slido will stay open. So if you think of things that you'd like to have training on, you can still go to Slido and put a suggestion in there. Partnering with parents to implement rewards and sanctions in the home. Responding to marijuana use. Yes, so Ohio just legalized marijuana. We should definitely do a webinar on marijuana next year. That's a great idea. You're waiting to go to treatment. Yeah, like for waiting for a bed. We don't want to put kids into detention, but what do we do instead? All right, excellent. And I think we've got some more coming into chat. All right, thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate everybody participating. And then we'll see you next year. The next Tune In Tuesday will be in February of 2024. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your year.